deep into a topic that's huge E for Catholics, the Eucharist, but with a twist.
Okay.
We're not just looking at what it is,
Right.
but like why it matters so much. And get this, we're going way back to its Jewish roots.
I like it.
It's like finding the missing puzzle piece. You know? Like it just
Yeah.
unlocks this whole deeper understanding.
It's true, and it's fascinating how we often view Judaism and Christianity as like separate things, even like opposing forces, when in reality, the early Christians were Jewish.
Totally.
Their existing faith, it didn't get replaced. It formed the foundation for their belief in the Eucharist.
Whoa, that's like mind-blowing. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah.
So if these early Christians were Jewish, like what were they expecting based on their faith?
Well, they were longing for a new Exodus.
Okay.
Like a messianic echo of that liberation from Egypt.
Okay.
They're waiting for a new Moses, a new Passover, even a return of that miraculous manna from heaven.
Hold on, manna? Like that weird bread stuff from the desert?
Yeah.
What's that got to do with anything?
It has everything to do with it.
Okay.
Think about it for a second.
Okay.
Manna, it was supernatural, right?
Right.
A sign of God's covenant. It was even called bread of angels.
Oh, wow.
It foreshadowed something greater.
Okay. I'm listening.
Now enter Jesus.
Okay.
He calls himself the bread of life, directly referencing that manna.
Wow.
He even uses this mysterious word in the Lord's Prayer, epiousios,
Right.
which actually translates more closely to supernatural bread.
No way, I've said that prayer a million times and never knew that.
Yeah.
So are you saying like the Eucharist is manna 2.0?
Essentially, yes.
Wow.
And it goes even deeper.
Okay.
Remember how the Israelites, they kept a portion of manna in the Ark of the Covenant?
Right, they treated it as holy.
Exactly. Uniquely holy.
Yeah.
And then you have the Jewish temple with the bread of the presence.
Okay.
This continual offering symbolizing God's presence among his people.
Wait a minute, Catholics do that.
Right.
We have the tabernacle, the monstrance, that's all coming together.
Exactly. These parallels, they're not coincidental.
Right.
Early Christians, they saw the Eucharist as the new Passover meal, the new manna, A&D, the ultimate bread of presence.
Wow.
But now, with Christ himself truly present.
So it's not just bread, it's this deeply symbolic act connecting back to centuries of Jewish tradition.
That's exactly right.
That makes the Catholic reverence for the Eucharist makes so much more sense.
It's about encountering the divine, experiencing God's love in a tangible way, just as the Jews did with the manna and the bread of presence.
Wow. Talk about food for thought, literally.
Yeah.
So to bring it back to the Exodus, how does that tie into the Eucharist? I mean, it's this huge event, the Exodus, but I'm not quite seeing the connection.
Of course. You see, for the Jewish people, the Exodus wasn't just some event in the past, It was the defining moment.
Okay.
It established their covenant with God, it represented their deliverance and that promise of going back to the promised land.
Right.
And the prophets, they kept pointing towards a future where God would again liberate his people.
Just like he did from Egypt.
Exactly.
So they were waiting for a repeat performance, a new liberation.
Yes, but this wasn't just about political freedom.
No.
It was much deeper than that.
What do you mean?
They yearned for a spiritual liberation, freedom from sin and death itself.
That makes sense.
So where does Jesus fit into all of this?
Well, Jesus understanding this deep longing of his people,
Right.
he intentionally mirrored parts of the Exodus in his own ministry.
Like what?
Well, take his baptism in the Jordan River, for example.
Okay.
This wasn't just a symbolic gesture,
Right.
It was a deliberate echo of the Israelites crossing the Jordan into the Promised Land.
I never made that connection.
And then you have the miracles, feeding the multitudes with almost nothing.
Like a new manna miracle.
Exactly. These weren't just isolated events.
Right.
They were purposeful echoes of the Exodus story. So Jesus was saying, like, remember that liberation you're waiting for? Well, I'm here to make it happen.
Precisely.
That's powerful. But this time, the Promised Land wasn't a physical place, right?
Right. Correct.
So where does the Eucharist come in? Is that the Promised Land?
You're getting warmer.
Okay.
To really grasp the Eucharist, we need to look at its connection to one specific part of the Exodus, the Passover.
The Passover. The one with the lamb's blood and the angel of death.
Yes.
I think I see a connection to the Eucharist, but help me out here.
It's not as strange as it seems. The Passover wasn't just about death, it was about life and deliverance.
Okay.
The Israelites weren't just going through the motions, they were pleading for God's protection and the act of actually eating the Passover lamb,
Right.
it held huge significance.
It's like they were remembering it, but also participating in it.
Exactly. They weren't just remembering, they were actively participating in the very act of deliverance.
Wow.
It was like they were consuming their freedom.
Consuming their freedom. That's intense.
And this idea of taking part in a sacred meal as a way to experience deliverance.
Right.
That's key as we dive deeper into how it connects to the Eucharist.
Consuming their freedom. That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
So how does Jesus take this idea of the Passover meal and change it?
Okay, so put yourself in the shoes of a first century Jew, right? You're sitting there with Jesus and his disciples at the Last Supper.
Okay.
It's Passover, everyone's expecting the traditional meal, but what Jesus does next, it would have been totally unexpected.
Okay, now you've got me on the edge of my seat. What happens?
So Jesus takes bread, he blesses it, and says to his disciples, eat, this is my body.
Whoa.
And then he takes the cup of wine and says, drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins.
Wow, those words. This I is my body. This I is my blood. I can't even imagine how shocking that would have been to hear back then. Talk about a plot twist.
It's huge, E. You see, for the Jewish people back then, any talk about blood, especially human blood, that was totally taboo.
Right.
And here's Jesus, not only saying his blood will be poured out, but asking them to drink it.
It's like he's taking this Passover meal and making it about his own death.
It's even bigger than that. Remember that yearning they had for a new Exodus, for that spiritual freedom?
Right.
This new Passover meal, this was Jesus declaring himself as that new sacrificial lamb, the one to free his people from sin and death once and for all.
So instead of an animal sacrifice in the temple, it's Jesus offering himself. And the bread and wine, they become his body and blood, the symbols of this new covenant, this new Exodus.
Exactly. For those early Christians who grew up with Passover, this wasn't cannibalism. It was the ultimate way to participate in God's plan. They saw their longing for freedom coming true right there in that meal.
That makes a lot of sense. This Passover connection really helps me understand why the Eucharist is so important to Catholics. But you mentioned manna earlier. Where does that fit into all of this?
Oh, the connection is amazing. Remember how after leaving Egypt, the Israelites were out in the desert complaining about being hungry?
Can't say I blame them. 40 years in the desert sounds rough.
But God being merciful, he provided for them. He sent manna, this bread from heaven, to sustain them on their journey.
It wasn't just any bread, right?
Oh, no. It was described as white, tasting like wafers made with honey.
Interesting.
Almost a little taste of that promised land flowing with milk and honey.
Okay, I see what you're doing there. So this manna was a real sign from God reassuring them and keeping them going on their journey.
Exactly, but here's the thing. This bread of angels, it wasn't just a random miracle. The Jewish people saw it as a foreshadowing of something even greater to come.
Now that makes you think, what could possibly be greater than bread from heaven?
Well, who shows up centuries later calling himself the bread of life, directly echoing that miracle of the manna?
Jesus. He's saying he's the new and ultimate manna, the true bread from heaven.
You got it. And he takes it even further. In John 6.51, he says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh.
He's making a direct connection. Just like manna sustained the Israelites physically, Jesus, this true bread of life, he's going to sustain us on our spiritual journey.
And it goes even deeper. Remember how the Israelites treasured the manna, even keeping some of it in the Ark of the Covenant?
Right, as this sacred reminder of what God had done.
In the same way, Catholics preserve and adore the Eucharist in the tabernacle.
It's like the Ark of the Covenant 2.0. It's amazing how these connections all come together.
It really highlights that Catholic belief in the real presence. Catholics aren't just remembering a meal, they're encountering the living God made physically present in the Eucharist. The same God who gave manna is now present offering nourishment for our souls.
It's really incredible when you see how the Eucharist, the Passover, even manna, all these connections, it just creates this amazing picture. But you mentioned there's even more to uncover.
There is one last connection, a really fascinating one. We've talked about the Passover, the manna, but there's another parallel in the Jewish temple, the bread of presence.
Bread of presence. Okay,
Yeah.
That sounds familiar, but can you give me a quick refresher?
Yeah. Okay, so picture the ancient Jewish temple inside in the Holy of Holies where they kept the Ark of the Covenant. There was also this golden table.
Okay.
And on this table, every Sabbath, they would place 12 loaves of unleavened bread.
12 loaves,
Right.
representing the 12 tribes of Israel. A symbolic offering to God. But what made this bread of presence different from just regular bread.
It wasn't about feeding God. It was a sacred offering, a perpetual due before the Lord. It represented his continual presence among the Israelites. They even had a special term for it in Hebrew, lechem panim, literally bread of the face.
Bread of the face. Whose face?
The rabbis, they interpreted it as the bread of the face of God. It represented God's closeness to his people, like a tangible reminder that he wasn't far off, but right there with them.
Wow, it's amazing how these little details held so much meaning. So this bread of presence symbolized God being present with his people. And then along comes Jesus and says,
I am the bread of life.
Exactly. He takes this ancient Jewish concept, this symbol of God's presence, and says, I am the true bread of presence, the ultimate embodiment of God with you.
Exactly. And there's even more. During Passover, the rabbis would lift up the bread of presence for everyone to see, and they'd proclaim, behold God's love for you.
Hold on. That's exactly what the priest does at Mass when he elevates the host.
You got it. It's not just a random gesture. It's a direct echo of that old Jewish tradition, a visual proclamation of God's love made present in the Eucharist.
This is mind-blowing. You've revealed this whole hidden tapestry woven into the Eucharist, all this Jewish tradition and scripture. It's like I'm seeing it for the first time.
And that's the beauty of it. The Eucharist, it's not just some ritual. It's deeply rooted in the heart of Jewish tradition. It's the new Passover where we consume the Lamb of God. It's the new manna nourishing us on our spiritual journey. And it's the new bread of presence, making God's love real and accessible.
This deep dive has completely changed how I see the Eucharist and its significance. For everyone listening, next time you encounter the Eucharist, remember those echoes of Jewish heritage. It's a story of liberation, sustenance, and most importantly, the never-ending presence of God's love. Thanks for joining us for this incredible deep dive.